welcome back to our continued study of the coherence of theism. Today we're going to talk about religious language, continuing our discussion of words of theology. Today we're going to give a historical overview of accounts of religious language, starting in late antiquity, continuing to the medieval era, and then going on to the modern accounts. Begin with some terminology that often occurs in these debates. So I want to talk about the difference between cataphatic and apophatic theology. Cataphatic theology comes from the Greek word kataphasis, which is a combination of an intensifier kata and a verb phanai, which means to speak. Cataphatic theology basically is to attribute positive properties to God. So both of the senses we've been talking about in using words in mundane senses to apply to God, so talk God's power is the same to talk about human power, but of much greater extent, and also the use of analogy to attribute positive properties to God would be examples of cataphatic theology. Apophatic theology comes from the Greek word apophasis, which is from the verb apophemi, which means to deny. Apophatic theology denies attributing any positive properties to God. Apophatic theology is also known as the via negativa, and this is the language that Swinburne uses. Swinburne describes in via negativa this way. He says, "All that we can say about God is what he is not. Positive statements such as God is good or God is wise have to be understood either negatively, as God is not evil or God is not foolish, or as claiming that God is the cause of created things having the property." Apophatic theology is strongly associated with Eastern Orthodox versions of Christianity. Broadly speaking, there are three main forms of Christianity. One is the Eastern Orthodox view, the other is Catholicism, and then there's Protestantism. Apophatic theology, as I said, is associated with Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It begins with Basil of Caesarea. Basil of Caesarea distinguished between knowing God's properties and knowing God's essence. And then this is picked up by a person calling himself Dionysius, but now is referred to as Pseudo-Dionysius. And Pseudo-Dionysius says that God is in no way like things that have being, and we have no knowledge at all of his incomprehensible, ineffable transcendence and invisibility. So the thought here is that God is a being of such transcendence that any means by which we come to think about God is inadequate at getting at what God is like. So incomprehensibility means you can't, of course, comprehend it. Ineffable means you can't F it, right? To F something, you have to grasp it. So ineffable transcendence means it's a completely other being beyond, right, human categorization. And so it's something that is in, to borrow a phrase from Thomas Kempis, a cloud of unknowing. I do want to point out to you a very good article by Jonathan Jacobs. It was published in 2015. It's entitled "The Ineffable, Inconceivable, and Incomprehensible God, Fundamentality and Apophatic Theology." It was published in the Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion, and I'll provide a link to it in the description. So following along Swinburne's discussion, I want to turn now to look at Aquinas' argument against apophatic theology. This is an argument that Swinburne endorses, so let's look at the passage from Aquinas that Swinburne quotes. Here's what Aquinas writes. This is a passage, as you'll note in footnote, is from Summa Contra Gentiles, the other of Aquinas' very well-known works, the first being the Summa Theologica. So Aquinas writes here, he says, "A name is predicated of some being uselessly, unless through that name we understand something of the being. But if names are said of God and creatures in a purely equivocal way," remember equivocal here is that you use it in a completely different sense, and also the idea in the background is you don't specify what that other sense is. So he says, "But if names are said of God and creatures in a purely equivocal way, we understand nothing of God through those names. For the meanings of those names are known to us solely to the extent that they are said of creatures. In vain, therefore, would it be said or proved of God that he is a being, good, or the like." So we want to develop the ability to take a passage and then reconstruct the argument in premise and conclusion form. This will enable us to be very explicit about the reasoning that's going on, and also enable us to see if we've really understood what the issue is. Here's my reconstruction of Aquinas' anti-apophatic argument. So the first premise says that if some predicate F in a sentence of the form A is F, where A is a subject and then F is being used to predicate some feature of A, if F is a predicate in a sentence A is F, and F is being used equivocally, so it's being used in this new, completely new sense that's unspecified, then the sentence A is F does not have a meaning, doesn't communicate a thought. Premise 2, apophatic theology claims that predicates applied to God are used equivocally. So it would follow from these two claims that apophatic theological statements have no meaning. There are a couple ways we can evaluate arguments. We can ask, is the argument logically valid? And this level of assessment asks, if the premises are true, does it follow that the conclusion is true? And so in the first premise, we have a sufficient condition for a sentence not having any meaning. It says that if a term in that sentence is used in a completely new sense, and that sense isn't specified, then the sentence doesn't have a meaning. And then the second premise says that, well, apophatic theology uses predicates in this way when they're applied to God, and so that would satisfy the sufficient condition for those sentences not having any meaning, and so the conclusion is that those sentences or statements do not have any meaning. And so it's a logically valid argument. Now the question is, are the premises true? And so you might ask, is the first premise true? Is there a way a sentence could have a meaning even if its central predicate doesn't have a specified meaning to it? So that seems pretty safe to me. How about the second premise? Apophatic theology claims that predicates applied to God are used equivocally. They're used in this way where they take a common term like good and they apply it in a completely new and novel way to God, where it's just thought that this, to say that God is good doesn't have any connection with our use of good when we apply it to common objects. So there the question is there a difference between apophatic statements and statements with equivocal terms? And I think this is an interesting question, so I point you again to Jonathan Jacobs' article if you're interested in following up with that. And there's some good responses to Jonathan's article. There's a nice article by Lorraine Keller, which I'll link to as well, and you can read that. So then what Swinburne does in the remaining part of this section is he develops a bit a Thomistic view of analogy, and then he talks about two other major medieval philosophers, Duns Scotus and William Ockham. So the starting point for Aquinas' view of analogy is the intuition that God is a very different kind of being from any created being. So Aquinas is very emphatic that we do not use words univocally when applied to God and creatures. So the Thomistic doctrine of analogy begins with some terminology. There's the res significata, which is a term to specify the property that is signified by the predicate. And then there's the modus significandi, where this is the way in which the property is present in the object. So Swinburne discusses this at some length, and he gives an example of knowledge. I think it's more helpful to focus on these two examples, which in my mind are a bit clearer. So consider the word intelligent as applied to a dog and as also applied to a professional chemist. The word intelligence has a core meaning. So the property signified by the predicate intelligent, the res significata, is the same in both instances, where you would say that this dog is intelligent and this chemist is intelligent. But the modus significandi in the cases are different. The way the property of intelligence is present in a dog is different from the way the property of intelligence is present in a professional chemist. In a way, this is just to say the standards for intelligence in a dog differ from the standards of intelligence in a chemist, even though the property signified by the predicate intelligence is the same in both cases. Consider the predicate running as applied to a cheetah and also applied to a marathoner. Here, the res significata, the property signified, is the same. It has a core meaning, what it is to run, so that you know, or in virtue of knowing the meaning of running, you know what it is when a cheetah is running, and when a marathoner is running, you know what that is. But the modus significandi, the way in which the property is present in the object, is different in both cases. Cheetahs run on all fours and sort of bound across the plane, whereas a marathoner, obviously doesn't run on all fours, and the means by which they propel themselves is both different from a cheetah and equally quite impressive. So then Swinburne on page 84 and 85 discusses two later medieval thinkers, Duns Scotus and William Ockham. I'll let you read his descriptions of those. I want to say, though, that the issue of religious language and how language is used to apply to God is a huge issue. It's discussed, as we've seen, from, Basil of Caesarea all the way, to William of Ockham, and that's a span of, almost 1,000 years, and it's continued to discuss. When we turn in just a minute to these modern accounts, it's somewhat interesting that the past the past 50 years, so basically, maybe even the past 60 years, from like 1960 to present day, the issue of a religious language isn't as significant as perhaps it should be. Modern approaches to religious language really began with the triumph of empiricism in the late part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, and the development of empiricist views in the Vienna Circle, the development of logical positivism, and the turn to logical empiricism. We saw in Lecture 1 A.J. Ayer's verificationist approach to ethics and religious belief, which claims that ethics and religious beliefs lack verification conditions, and so it's meaningless. These non-cognitivist views, of course, developed in various ways. Swinburne is holding off discussion of the non-cognitivist views until the next chapter, and we'll discuss these in more detail in the next lecture. I do want to note just at the outset here R.B. Brightwaite's view of religious statements. It's a non-cognitivist view. And so he says in this very famous article in 1955, which we'll discuss also in the next lecture, that religious statements are, quote, primarily declarations of adherence to a policy of action, declarations of commitment to a way of life. So religious beliefs and religious statements aren't statements of fact, they are statements of intention. For example, he says, the statement God is love expresses an intention to follow a loving or agapeist way of life. So the picture on the screen is R.B. Brightwaite. I want to close the lecture by looking at Swinburne's discussion of two more contemporary views. There's I.M. Crombie's article, The Possibility of Theological Statements, and then William Alston's article, Functionalism in Theological Language. So let's turn and look at Swinburne's discussion of Crombie. What I want to highlight about both of these approaches, I think it gives you a sense of the importance of the debate over how religious language functions. It gives you a better sense of the putative transcendental character of this being that people are trying to describe. Swinburne here is discussing Crombie's view. He says, in order to show what such claims as God loves us mean, we have to clarify about whom we are talking and clarify what we are saying about him. We cannot fix the reference of God by pointing to him literally or giving a description, since the descriptions, which are sometimes offered as uniquely characterizing him, you would say the first cause, the necessary being, are such that nobody can say what it would be like to conform to one of them. But we can, Crombie affirms, get some sense of what a first cause is by reflecting on the whole universe and parables of people making things. And we can get some idea of what God is supposed to be like by considering the attributes of people which cannot be analyzed in purely materialist terms. Loving, feeling, hoping, even seeing are obvious examples. Considering these characteristics, which have a relative independence of space, we get the notion of it being independent of space, a spirit, or rather not a conception, but the hint of the possibility of something we cannot conceive, but which lies outside the range of possible conception in a determinate direction. Using the word spirit as anything other than an abstract noun invokes the deliberate commission of a category mistake. Under the pressure of convictions, which require us to depart from normal language practice in this way. In all cases, Crombie claims that predicates, such as loves, are used of God not because they fit exactly, but because they are the nearest words we have for what we want to say. For example, we use the word love because we believe in some kind of resemblance or analogy between, say, human love and divine love. In using such words of God, we affirm a parable. So then Swinburne comments about Crombie's claims here. He says that, I take from this account the claim expounded in chapter 4 that theology makes category mistakes, that is, introduces new syntactic rules for the use of words, as well as the point that in affirming of God predicates such as loving, we are affirming the existence in God of a property similar to the property so named in ordinary language, for example, love. Crombie here provides a good modern example of the analogical use of terms to pick out properties of God. Now, Swinburne does observe that in the 1950s and later, after the view that religious language was meaningless was successfully criticized, that discussion tended to assume that words were used in ordinary senses, and so the tradition of analogical use of religious language has faded into the background. So Swinburne does highlight William Alston's article, Functionalism and Theological Language, which does give substantive discussion to the question of how religious language is used. And so I'm going to look at the passage that Swinburne quotes on page 88. So Alston writes, functionalism, as an improved version of behaviorism, seeks to preserve the basic insight that the function of the psyche is the guidance of behavior, while avoiding the simple-minded idea that each psychological state determines behavioral dispositions all by itself. So a little background might be helpful here. Behaviorism is a view that psychological states are just behavioral states, and so to attribute someone a particular psychological state, for example, to say that they're angry, is to describe a set of actions that they're going to engage in or a set of behaviors that they will display. This view comes under a lot of criticism in the late 1940s and 1950s, and a view that develops in the philosophy of mind is known as functionalism. So functionalism comes from the notion of a functional state, which is developed from computer programming terminology. So in the 1920s and 1930s, you had the development of a lot of background, relating to the modern computer, and you had the idea that you can characterize certain states functionally in terms of input and output relations. And then this idea gets carried over to a model of the mind that psychological states are functional states, characterizable in terms of a vast network of input and output relations. So the connection for a functionalist between a mental state and a particular behavior is looser than for a behaviorist. So then Swinburne writes, functionalism, as an improved version of behaviorism, seeks to preserve the basic insight that the function of the psyche is the guidance of behavior, while avoiding the simple-minded idea that each psychological state determines behavioral dispositions all by itself. It tries to bring this off by thinking of a belief, for example, as indeed related to potential behavior, but only through the mediation of psychological states. A belief that it is raining is, among other things, a disposition to carry an umbrella if one's going outside, provided one has such and such other beliefs, desires, aversions, attitudes, etc. The concept of belief is, in part, the concept of a certain way in which a state combines with other states and processes to determine behavior. A belief has the function of combining with other beliefs to inferentially produce still other beliefs. The function of combining with desires and aversions and other beliefs to produce other desires and aversions, as when my belief that I can't get a wanted object without earning money gives rise to a derivative desire to earn money. And the function of combining with desires to produce effective reactions, as when my belief that I have not been accepted to medical school combines with my desire to go to medical school to produce disappointment, as well as the function of combining with other psychological states to influence behavior. Clearly, a complete analysis of a psychological concept along functionalist lines would be an enormously complicated affair and perhaps beyond human power to achieve. So then, Alston applies this to theological claims. He says, the application to theological predication should be obvious in its main lines. The same functional concept of knowledge that P, or of purpose to bring about R, could be applicable to God and to man, even though the realization of that function is radically different. even though what it is to know that P is radically different in the two cases. So you should be thinking, oh, this sounds a lot like Aquinas' account of predication, of the distinction between res significata and modus significandi. We can form no notion of what it is to be like God, to know or to purpose as God does, while still thinking of God in terms that we understand because they both apply to us. So then Swinburne remarks that God does not have a body, but his purposes are executed by him, bringing about states of the world directly. So although some features of human mental states would not hold for divine mental states, a functionalist approach to psychological concepts make it possible to start with human psychological concepts and create psychological concepts that literally apply to God. And so you can continue to read Swinburne's discussion, but this is another way to fill out Aquinas' doctrine of analogy. So Swinburne's remaining discussion here of Austin's view is important because he goes in a direction that I wasn't expecting him to go in. So he says that on Austin's account, the word purpose, belief, and so on may not apply to God in their ordinary senses. But if we think of the world as that through which God acts, in the way that we act through our bodies, we could easily replace the ordinary senses of these words by fully intelligible senses that apply to God. God's beliefs are states that, together with his desires and other psychological states, and given God's limitless powers, make the sort of difference to the world that our psychological states make to our bodies, given our powers. So the way Swinburne is understanding Austin's view here is that for Austin, what it is for God to have a belief, a desire, to have a power, is for God to be in a state that has a certain functional role. But what that state is like is undefined. It's just a complex input-output mechanism. What Swinburne says later on in this page is that Austin's account resembles a Kantian account where God is conceived of as a noumenal object. So I'll let you look on the bottom of page 90 and 91 to see what that says, but I'll just read on in my own copy here. He says that Austin's functionalist account emphasizes that all the divine mental properties, God's knowledge, wisdom, goodness, and so on, interact for God to produce effects, and thus we cannot give such a simple account of God's wisdom or whatever in terms of the effects that it would have by itself. And then he continues, he says, but otherwise Kant's account is the same as Austin, that God is this noumenal object that we can't directly conceive of. And then he comments and he says, I do not find any of these accounts plausible as an account of the normal use of religious language for the reason that Aquinas gave, that positive predicates, good, wise, and so on, are used to tell us something about what God is like in himself. So I think this is really interesting because Austin's account does seem, in some sense, in the same game as analogy, and in the same, in the same broad spectrum of Aquinas' distinction between the res significata and modus significandi. But for Swinburne, he thinks it stretches too thin the notion of purpose and knowledge and wisdom as it would apply to God, because it just has this functional role. So Swinburne says that as far as Austin's or Kant's account go, God could be a non-conscious computer. So I think this is if you're looking for something to pick on, this would be a good point to pick on this. Go and read Austin's essay, or go and read, go and read Kant. Although, for myself, I haven't found reading Kant very clarifying, so I would prefer to read Austin. But go and read this and think about this. Is this a fair criticism of Austin's view? Okay, so next up, attitude theories, the non-cognitivist approach to religious statements.